Hello, and welcome to another episode of Miss Melnick's Tiny Desk Bedtime Stories. As I was looking through my shelf, I came across these two books that I can remember that my mother read to me when I was a little girl. These are called books from the Just So Stories series, which is kind of hard to say. They're written by Rudyard Kipling. And this is a series of books that kind of explains how animals have their certain adaptations and their certain different things that they have on their physical bodies. But it's just kind of it's just kind of an innovative way to explain how these things happened. Now, these two books were mine when I was a little girl, but they're also available on myON in a much more up-to-date format. So let me turn my computer so that you can see what's going on a student's computer. So a student can log into myON, just like I have done here, and you can see how the camel got his hump, how the elephant got his trunk, how the leopard got his spots, and how the rhinoceros got his skin. So if I open this book, you can see that I can choose to read it, or I can choose to add it to my favorites. I'm going to press on the read it button, and I actually started it, so I'm going to start it over.
How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin, the graphic novel by Rudyard Kipling.
So you can see that's a much more modern, up-to-date way to get the same story. But I'm going to read to you the book that was mine when I was a little girl. So this one is available on myON as well. Today I'm going to be reading to you How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin. And pardon me just a moment while I adjust the camera down a little bit. Okay, here we go. Just So Story Series by Rudyard Kipling, How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin. Now, boys and girls, as I read this story to you, there are going to be some words in here that are very hard to say. So watch what I do. When I come to words that I don't know, I'm going to chunk the little parts that I do know and try to figure it out as best as I can. Just So Story Series, How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin. This story was originally written in 1898, but this book we've had in my family since 1942. It's an old book, but it's an even older story. Once upon a time, on an uninhabited island on the shores of the Red Sea, there lived a Parsee, from whose hat the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the Parsee lived by the Red Sea with nothing but his hat and his knife and a cooking stove, of the kind that you must particularly never touch. And one day he took flour and water and currants and plums and sugar and things and made himself one cake, which was 2 feet across and 3 feet thick. It was indeed a superior comestible. That's magic. And he put it on the stove because he was allowed to cook on that stove. And he baked it and he baked it till it was all done, brown, and smelt most sentimental. But just as he was going to eat it, there came down to the beach from the altogether uninhabited interior one rhinoceros with a horn on his nose, 2 piggy eyes, and few manners. In those days, rhinoceros's skin fitted him quite tight. There were no wrinkles in it anywhere. He looked exactly like a Noah's Ark rhinoceros, but of course, much bigger. All the same, he had no manners then, and he has no manners now, and he never will have any manners. He said, "How?" And the Parsee left that cake and climbed up to the top of a palm tree with nothing on but his hat, from which the rays of the sun were always reflected in more than oriental splendor. And the rhinoceros upset the oil stove with his nose, and the cake rolled on the sand, and he spiked that cake on the horn of his nose, and he ate it. And he went away, waving his tail, to the desolate and exclusively uninhabited interior, which abuts the islands of Mazandaran, Socotra, and the promontories of the larger equinox. Then the Parsee came down from his palm tree and put the stove on its legs and recited the following sloka, which you have not heard. I will now proceed to relate. Them that takes cakes, which the Parsee man bakes, makes dreadful mistakes. And there was a great deal more in that than you would think, because 5 weeks later, there was a heat wave in the Red Sea, and everybody took off all the clothes they had. The Parsee took off his hat, but the rhinoceros took off his skin and carried it over his shoulder as he came down to the beach to bathe. In those days, it buttoned underneath with 3 buttons and looked like a waterproof. He said nothing whatever about the Parsee's cake because he had eaten it all, and he never had any manners then, since, or henceforth. He waded straight into the water and blew bubbles through his nose, leaving his skin on the beach. Presently, the Parsee came by and found the skin, and he smiled one smile that ran all around his face 2 times. Then he danced 3 times around the skin and rubbed his hands. Then he went to his camp and filled his hat with cake crumbs, for the Parsee never ate anything but cake and never swept out his camp. He took that skin and he shook that skin and he scrubbed that skin and he rubbed that skin, just as full of old, dry, stale, tickly cake crumbs and some burned currants as ever it could possibly hold. Then he climbed to the top of his palm tree and waited for the rhinoceros to come out of the water and put it on. And the rhinoceros did. He buttoned it up with 3 buttons, and it tickled like cake crumbs in bed. Then he wanted to scratch, but that made it worse. And then he lay down on the sands and rolled and rolled and rolled, and every time he rolled, the cake crumbs tickled him worse and worse and worse. Then he ran to the palm tree and rubbed himself against it. He rubbed so much and so hard that he rubbed his skin into a great fold over his shoulders and another fold underneath where the buttons used to be. But he rubbed the buttons off. And he rubbed some more folds over his legs. It spoiled his temper, but it didn't make the least difference to the cake crumbs. They were inside his skin and they tickled. So he went home very angry indeed and horribly scratchy. And from that day to this, every rhinoceros has great folds in his skin and a very bad temper, all on account of the cake crumbs inside. But the Parsee came down from his palm tree, wearing his hat, from which the rays of the sun were reflected in more than oriental splendor, packed up his cooking stove, and went away in the direction of Orotava, Amygdala, and the upland meadows of Anatavario and the marshes of Sonaput. The end. Boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed that silly story. And don't forget that you can go on myON and read the book in the form of a graphic novel and then take an AR test on it. How the Rhinoceros Got His Skin by Rudyard Kipling. Good night.